Last week, Black Widow came out and delivered a solid return at the box office, the best yet in the post-pandemic era. Let's talk about these numbers. Renegade Online. So Black Widow launched off this past weekend with an $80 million domestic haul, at least as the estimates stand right now. There was also another almost $80 million at the international box office, bringing this movie's opening weekend total to just shy of $160 million. A very admirable performance of a movie like this. A little surprising, to be quite honest. I really didn't think Black Widow was going to be able to outplay F9. F9 was a theatrical-only release. Black Widow, of course, was also day-and-date release on Disney+. We'll get into those numbers in a minute. So a little surprising for this from a movie that seemed to have, at most, a very tepid, mediocre level of interest in it. This was effectively an origin-type story for a Marvel character that's been around for 10 years now and died 2 years ago in Avengers Endgame. So this movie felt, like many have said, very out of place. Of course, this movie was supposed to come out a year ago, but the movie itself probably should have come out 4 or 5 years ago to be more relevant. But that being said, we have some good numbers so far from Black Widow, but they're still not that great. Not considering what Disney spent on this. The production budget reportedly around $200 million from the Walt Disney Studios. And then also you have to figure in on the distribution side, because Disney is not only the distributor, but also the studio that produced it. So the $200 million production budget, and then probably easily at least another $100 million in marketing, if not more than that. And of course, there's also the interest and carrying charges that they've had to contend with over the past 12 to 14 months since this movie was completed. Actually longer than that, since principal photography and production was completed, of carrying costs on the interests on the debt. You can probably figure on a movie like this somewhere around $1 million a month, as many people have said, and I think that's a fair estimate in interest costs. So if you add another $12 to $15 million on top of that, plus at least another $100 million, maybe $150 million or more in marketing costs, Black Widow has a tall ladder to climb right now to get over that hump just for Disney to even break even on this sucker. If you take the rule of thumb of about 50 to 60% of domestic and international markets of the gross take, of course, with one exception being China, where the average take from a Chinese market is about 25%, the CCP basically gets to keep the other 75%. Well, because that's what governments like that do. They like to appropriate things that don't belong to them. So in any case, Disney has a tall ladder to climb. They really need to get north of realistically, I'd say $700 million before they're actually going to start seeing a profit on this in total between marketing and production and carrying costs. I don't see them getting there. I really don't. Now, Disney, interestingly, very interestingly, in the last 24 hours, for the first time ever, has released an official statement on Disney Plus numbers. Now, this is something that they have not yet done. And Disney put those numbers at $60 million of revenue. So if we break that down at a $29.99 US dollar cost for Black Widow for the Disney Premier access, that puts us at around 2 million households, or rather 2 million Disney Plus accounts that ponied up the $30 to buy the movie. Now, of course, international markets, pricing is going to be a little bit different here and there. We don't know how many of those or where exactly they're released. You assume they're released it globally in all their markets. Of course, India is one of their newest markets where Disney Plus subscribership is a fraction of what it is here in the U.S. Basically, U.S. Disney Plus subscribers are subsidizing places like India, where the subscriptions are only about $2 to $3 a month. When you translate them into U.S. dollar cost, when you do the currency exchange. So I don't know if they're selling it over there for the same $30 US. I imagine not. It might be $10 over there. We don't know how many subscriptions came in from where. However, and I was waiting for this, we did have a bit of confirmation, because when I saw that figure, I'm like, wow, that's staggering. That's twice as much as they got with Mulan. And I was one of those guys that was an early adopter with Mulan as well. That was the first Disney Plus Premier Access movie that they had. And of course, the day after I bought the damn thing, I find out that Mulan is going to be available for free on Disney Plus in 90 days. So after that, I never did it again. I'm not doing it with Black Widow. And in all fairness, I haven't seen Black Widow. I really have no intention of seeing it. Probably once it lands on the free side of Disney Plus, I might check it out. But this was just not one of those movies that had any degree of interest for me. Mainly because we already know how the story ends. The character dies in Endgame. Spoiler alert, for nobody because everybody's seen Endgame. But that's where we are with this. So when I go back and I look at these numbers, I kind of have to scratch my head on a couple of things. And some of the Google trends, when we go back and look at some of the predecessors to this movie, when we look at F9 that came out about 3-4 weeks ago, when we look at A Quiet Place Part 2, Google had some pretty good trend lines on this. And we can see about a week before each movie released is where the ramp up started to happen in interest. A week before A Quiet Place Part 2, a week before F9. And then we get some numbers recently on Black Widow. And Black Widow, of course, blew up off the charts at casual glance on its opening day and then the Saturday afterwards. And that's all well and good. But the stories really drove this. And there's always that fear of missing out component when it comes to these kind of things. And it seems like we went from having very little interest online to all of a sudden we had a plethora of stories hitting about a week before the movie's released and 2 weeks before the movie's released, talking about how advanced ticket sales were record-setting. And that kind of piqued my interest. And because at that point, the pre-show interest, the week or 2 weeks leading up to the movie, had relatively the same level of interest as F9, relatively the same level of interest on Google Trends as A Quiet Place Part 2. And of course, those movies performed very well, but Black Widow obviously outperformed them, and not just by, 1 or 2%, but we're talking, about almost a 15% outperformance, 14% outperformance or so of F9. But the Google Trend numbers just didn't seem to reflect that. And especially when we add in now this $60 million haul on Disney Plus, which striking. I mean, good for them, but that's striking to me to think that there was this much interest when you pile that in. And of course, now Disney is using that to bolster, saying that this was a $200 million opening weekend. Well, if that's going to be the metric going forward for movies, then we're in a whole different world of measurement when it comes to box office success at this point. So I think this will be curious to see how this plays out going forward. But I just wonder, it's like I just don't see the trending lines that would seem to match up with a performance of that caliber. And I'm not suggesting there's any funny business or anything going on or some grand conspiracy to make us think that this movie didn't rake in the box office that it did. But, sometimes marketing departments can do things to certainly push interest into a movie, which is what their job is, like putting out stories about how healthy advanced ticket sales were and things like that. So when you see those kind of stories, it always kind of, it should perk your ears up. So the real question moving forward with this is, will this hold? Black Widow has been compared to other similar Marvel origin stories, character origin stories like Doctor Strange and Ant-Man that had a similar performance, being more towards the bottom end of all Marvel Cinematic Universe movies at the box office in terms of performance again. So when you go back and you look at Doctor Strange, it had a very similar opening weekend. However, if you do adjust for inflation, it does actually beat out Black Widow by a little bit. Of course, there was no Disney Plus back then, so that is something to take into account. And Black Widow, in that case, would have outperformed it theoretically under those same terms. But Doctor Strange had a much more levelized initial weekend, taking in about $32 million on a Friday, including Thursday night previews, taking in about $31 million on Saturday. Don't see that with Black Widow. And this is where my brain kind of goes off on this one. Black Widow had a very sharp drop-off from Friday to Saturday. Friday, we had almost $39 million, and on Saturday, almost half of that, about a 41-42% drop-off from Friday, which is a little unusual. Very, very curious. So it suggests to me that this movie is much more heavily front-loaded than traditional movies of this same sort. It's going to be very, very interesting to see how this movie grows as time goes on, or more likely at this point, retracts dramatically. And again, a movie like Doctor Strange that releases in early November of 2016, there's no real holidays right there when it comes out. This is a weekend kind of movie, whereas Black Widow, obviously, we're in the middle of summer, and there's much more opportunity here for people to go out on weekdays and see this kind of thing with kids out of school and things like that. So we're going to have to really look at this thing over the next couple of weeks. I suspect that this thing is going to slow down dramatically. The people who are going to have bought this on Disney Plus instead of going to a theater, that's pretty much already baked in. I don't think you're going to have any more large growth on Disney Plus at this point. I think that's, again, it's very front loaded, just like Mulan was, just like Cruella was. All of those kind of big ticket items happened early on, and Disney put the number out of 2 million. That was relatively well confirmed this afternoon around 1 o'clock Central Standard Time by Samba TV. And Samba TV, who I was waiting for before I made this video to come out with those numbers, did indeed suggest that 1.1 million U.S. households watched Black Widow this weekend. U.S. Remember, we said that it takes 2 million to get to 60 million, right? Well, ostensibly, those other 900,000 would have come from international markets, which pretty much plays out to the math you would expect. Having a little over 50% coming from the domestic market and the other half coming from international markets. So I think those numbers bear out. And with that Samba confirmation, I feel pretty comfortable that what Disney is reporting is probably pretty much on the money. Now, again, how much more Disney Plus purchases happen at this point? Anybody's guess, but it's probably not going to be that much. So we're going to keep an eye on this kind of thing and see where this goes from here. Sometimes for years I've wondered if movie studios tend to engage in some market shenanigans. For decades it's been widely known, it's actually one of the worst kept secrets in the world, that pretty much anybody can buy their way onto the New York Times bestseller list for books. If you have a couple of $100,000 from a marketing firm, if you're releasing a big enough title, and you can go out there and make the investment to get onto that bestseller list because that drives bigger and bigger sales. The idea being you're going to spend $100,000 or $200,000 to drive the sales you need to get on the bestseller list, and then that will return 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 times the amount of returns once the book is on the bestseller list in actual real sales. Could movie studios be doing this with ticket sales as well? It's possible. And again, it wouldn't take a company like Disney very much, maybe $5 or $10 million worth of that marketing budget to sink into places like Fandango and other ticket purchasing sites to buy phantom tickets. Just enough to where you can get those kind of stories that say, well, you know what? F9 had $10 million of advanced ticket sales. We want to beat that number, and we need to beat F9. Again, this is my hypothesis theory. This is just purely academic. I'm not suggesting Disney did this. I want to make this very clear. This is just all for, just academic purposes at this point. But is it really any sweat off of Disney's back to go out there and drop $5 or $10 million from their distribution channel's marketing budget into the ticket sales needed to generate the numbers that they want to get the kind of press they want that will then push audiences into the theater to the tune of an extra 10 million or 20 million in sales or 30 million in sales? From a business standpoint, if you could spend $5 or $10 million to turn around and then wind up making $20 or $30 million extra, would you do it? Well, sure you would. It's a great return on investment. So it'll be interesting to see if anybody ever comes out with stories like that, because I've always kind of wondered on some of these things. And again, some of the smaller studios and the smaller movies, they're not going to do stuff like this. But a company like Disney certainly has enough slack that they can. So anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below. This is going to be interesting to see how this persists and what this means for other movies coming out like Shang-Chi, like The Eternals coming out later this year. Again, none of these movies have any release dates set in China yet. So that's a real problem. Even though you only get 25% of the Chinese box office, when you're talking about movies that can potentially make $100, $200, $300 plus million in China, that 25% is still a fairly healthy number for these studios' bottom line. So in any case, share the video out, like the video, subscribe if you haven't already. I'm glad you're here. And until next time, take care.